I wasn't supposed to be the kind of woman who fell in love with dangerous men. Wasn't supposed to be the type who looked at a man whose hands had ended lives and seen something worth loving. But there I was on that perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, sitting in my pristine apartment with 3 letters spread across my kitchen table and the weight of 6 months' worth of secrets pressing against my chest like a stone. The diagnosis letter from Dr. Chen sat on the left, all clinical language and percentages that added up to one inevitable conclusion. I was dying. Had been dying since the moment those cells had turned traitor in my pancreas, spreading their poison through my body with the kind of efficiency I'd always brought to my work. The resignation letter I'd typed and retyped a dozen times sat in the middle, professionally worded and utterly inadequate for what I was really trying to say, which was that I couldn't bear to let Dante Caruso watch me waste away, couldn't stand the thought of becoming another problem for him to solve with his money and his power and his absolute refusal to accept defeat. And on the right, the letter I'd written by hand on his company stationery, a choice that felt simultaneously presumptuous and intimate. My last will and testament, such as it was, leaving my meager savings to the women's shelter on 5th Street, and asking whoever found it to please forgive me for the cowardice of running away. I'd worked for Dante for 2 years, 7 months, and 13 days. Not that I was counting. Not that I'd marked each day in my mind like a prisoner scratching lines on a cell wall, measuring out my sentence of loving him from the careful distance of professionalism and propriety. They'd warned me when I took the job, of course. The HR manager with her nervous hands and carefully worded disclaimers about the demanding nature of the position, the high turnover rate, the requirement for absolute discretion about matters that might occasionally fall into legally gray areas. What she hadn't mentioned was that Dante Caruso was the kind of man who rewrote the rules of what it meant to be alive, who moved through the world with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve through force of will or force of violence, whose presence in a room could make grown men sweat, and whose rare smiles could make my heart stop beating for dangerous, wonderful moments. I'd taken the job because I needed excellent health insurance, the universe's little joke, considering how spectacularly that had failed me, and because the salary was nearly double what I'd been making at my previous position, managing schedules for a pharmaceutical executive who'd treated his assistants like particularly useful appliances. What I'd found instead was a purpose I hadn't expected, a place in Dante's complicated world that felt like it had been carved out specifically for me, shaped to fit the particular talents I'd spent years developing, the ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to move through chaos with calm efficiency, to see everything and judge nothing, to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable. He'd promoted me from receptionist to executive assistant after 6 months, a meteoric rise that had caused resentment among the others until they'd realized that being close to Dante Caruso meant being close to the violence and danger that followed him like a shadow. And most people preferred to keep their distance from both. But I'd never been most people. Had never been the kind of woman who chose the safe path when the dangerous one called to something wild and hungry in my soul. I'd grown up in foster care, bounced between families who'd wanted the state checks more than they'd wanted me, learned early that the only person I could rely on was myself, that survival meant being smarter and harder and more competent than everyone around me. So I'd made myself invaluable to Dante, had learned the rhythms of his days and the patterns of his moods, had memorized how he took his coffee. 2 sugars, no cream, in the blue mug his mother had given him before she died, and which contracts needed my detailed review before they crossed his desk, and which associates were lying to him based on the tension in their shoulders when they spoke. I'd become the steady, reliable presence in his chaotic empire, the one person who never flinched when his men walked in with blood on their shirts, who never asked questions about the meetings that happened after midnight, or the phone calls he took in Italian with his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. And somewhere in those 2 years, 7 months and 13 days, I'd committed the cardinal sin of falling completely, irrevocably, devastatingly in love with him. It had happened slowly, then all at once, the way I imagined drowning must feel. The gradual realization that you're in over your head, followed by the sudden, desperate need for air that comes too late to save you. There'd been the first time he'd really looked at me, not through me the way people usually did, but at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd ever built, asking my opinion on a shipping route dispute with the Bratva, and actually listening to my answer, nodding slowly as I'd explain the legal implications and the potential diplomatic solutions, then implementing my suggestion and telling his second-in-command, Marco, that I was smarter than half his lawyers. There'd been the morning I'd come to work with a black eye from a car accident. Minor, just airbag deployment. And he'd gone completely still, voice dropping to that lethal quiet that preceded violence, demanding to know who'd hurt me. And I'd seen in that moment that he cared, that I was more to him than efficient furniture, even if that care was tangled up in his bone-deep need to protect what he considered his. There'd been 1,000 small moments after that, each one embedding itself in my heart like shrapnel I couldn't extract without bleeding out. The way he remembered that I took my coffee black and had started having a cup waiting for me when I arrived. The afternoon he'd found me crying in my office over a news story about children in foster care and had simply sat with me in silence until I could breathe again. The Christmas bonus that was exactly the amount I'd mentioned once, casually, that I was saving for my own apartment. He'd been building something with me without either of us acknowledging it. A relationship that existed in the space between professional and personal, that felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced despite never crossing the physical boundaries that would have made it real. And then 6 months ago, I'd gone to the doctor for what I'd thought was a persistent stomach ache, and walked out with a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology that boiled down to this, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, inoperable, untreatable in any way that would give me more than a few painful months of sickness and decline. My body already so compromised that the cancer had spread to my liver and lymph nodes before I'd even known to be worried. Dr. Chen had been kind but clinical, explaining my options with the detachment of someone who delivered this news too often to let it break her, telling me that aggressive chemotherapy might buy me 6 to 8 months, but would leave me violently ill and weak. That palliative care and pain management would let me maintain quality of life for perhaps 4 months before things became difficult. That I should get my affairs in order and spend time with people I loved. I'd sat in that sterile office with its inspirational posters and boxes of tissues strategically placed for maximum accessibility, and made a decision that felt both brave and cowardly in equal measure. I would decline treatment, would use my remaining time, on my own terms, would work as long as I could manage and then disappear quietly before I became a burden, before anyone had to watch me deteriorate, before Dante had to see me as anything other than the competent, capable woman who managed his empire with calm efficiency. I'd return to work the next day with his coffee and his schedule and a smile that felt like it might crack my face, and I'd spent the last 6 months pretending that everything was fine, while my body slowly betrayed me. While I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose and took increasingly strong pain medication to get through the days, and watched Dante's face for any sign that he'd noticed something was wrong. He hadn't. Or if he had, he'd chosen not to say anything. And I'd been grateful for that mercy even as it confirmed what I'd always known. I was important to him as an employee, as a trusted assistant who made his life easier, but I wasn't important enough for him to see me, really see me, the way I saw him, so I'd made my plans with the same meticulous attention to detail I brought to everything, had found a cabin in the mountains 3 hours north of the city, somewhere beautiful and peaceful where I could spend my final weeks watching autumn paint the trees in fire and gold, had packed my essentials and left the letters on my desk where someone would eventually find them, had paid 3 months' rent in advance on my apartment to avoid complications and disconnected my phone and driven away from the only life I'd ever loved. The cabin was perfect in its simplicity, rough-hewn logs and wide windows that framed the forest like a painting, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth against the October chill, furniture worn comfortable by years of use and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence after years of the city's constant noise. I'd spent my first day there crying, Not delicate tears, but the kind of sobbing that emptied your lungs and left you gasping, mourning not. Just my own death, but the life I'd never have, the love I'd never confess, the possibility of a future with Dante that had only ever existed in my most secret fantasies. I'd spent my second day writing in the journal I'd bought for this purpose, pouring out all the feelings I'd kept locked away for 2 years, the first time I'd realized I loved him, the dreams I'd had about kissing him, the way my body responded to his proximity like he was magnetic north and I was a compass needle trembling toward truth. By the third day, I'd started to find something that resembled peace, had begun to accept that this quiet ending was better than the alternative, better than wasting away in a hospital while Dante visited out of obligation and pity, better than seeing the disappointment in his eyes when he realized I was just human after all, fragile and failing and utterly incapable of being the steady presence he'd come to rely on. I'd taken my pain medication and made myself soup and sat by the fireplace reading the books I'd always meant to read, and I'd almost convinced myself that I'd made the right choice, that dying alone was dignity rather than cowardice, that leaving without saying goodbye was kindness rather than the cruelest thing I could do to someone who'd already lost too many people he cared about. And then on the fourth day, on what should have been another quiet step toward the inevitable, I heard the sound of a car in my gravel driveway, heard footsteps on my porch that I would have recognized anywhere, and looked up to see Dante Caruso standing in my doorway with my letters in his hand and an expression on his face that I'd never seen before, raw and furious and devastated all at once. And I realized with a sick, swooping sensation in my stomach that I hadn't escaped after all, that he'd found me, that everything I'd tried to avoid was about to come crashing down around me in ways I couldn't control or predict or prepare for. The universe had a cruel sense of humor, I thought distantly as Dante stood in my doorway, looking like vengeance personified, because I'd spent months imagining what it would feel like to have him look at me with real emotion instead of professional courtesy, had fantasized about seeing something raw and unguarded in those dark eyes that usually reflected nothing but calculated control. And now that I finally had his full attention, now that every ounce of his formidable focus was trained on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle and my heart race, it was because I was dying, and he'd found out in the worst possible way, reading my pathetic letters like discovering a stranger's diary, and realizing that the woman who'd brought him coffee every morning had been harboring secrets that apparently mattered enough for him to track me down like I was a fugitive from his empire. He crossed the threshold without invitation, without permission, moving with that predatory grace that had always made something primal in me want to either run or surrender, and I found myself pressing back against the armchair behind me even as part of me, the part that had loved him in silence for so long, wanted to close the distance between us, and throw myself into his arms, and pretend that his presence here meant something it couldn't possibly mean. Dante, I managed to say, his name scraping out of my throat rough and unsteady, and I hated how small my voice sounded, hated that the first word I spoke to him after running away was so obviously afraid when I'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of appearing unshakable in his presence. But the look on his face was stripping away every defense I'd ever built, and leaving me raw and exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the cancer eating me alive. How did you find me? How could you possibly have tracked me here when I was so careful to cover my tracks, to pay in cash and use a fake name and disappear completely? You used company stationery for your will, he said, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet that I'd heard him use before confrontations turned violent, the calm before storms that left bodies in their wake. And he held up the letters like evidence of betrayal, like proof of crimes I'd committed against him by daring to have a body that was failing and a heart that had broken under the weight of loving him. My stationery, Isabeau, with my logo watermarked into the paper, like you were writing me a memo about your own death, like this was just another piece of business correspondence to file away and forget about, and you really thought I wouldn't notice, wouldn't care enough to wonder where my assistant had disappeared to after 2 years of never missing a single day of work. The accusation in his voice cut deeper than any blade could have, drew blood from wounds I hadn't known I could still sustain, when I was already dying by degrees, and I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, feeling how much thinner I'd become in just the week since I'd left the city. How the cancer seemed to be accelerating now that I'd stopped pretending it wasn't happening. Stopped forcing myself through 12-hour workdays and smiling through the pain that had become my constant companion. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the same words I'd written in that letter. Inadequate then and inadequate now, incapable of conveying the enormity of what I was apologizing for. Not just for leaving, but for becoming someone who needed things from him that he couldn't give. For being human and fragile when he needed me to be invincible. For loving him when that was the most unprofessional and inappropriate thing I could possibly have done. I didn't mean for you to find those yet, didn't plan for anyone to discover them until after I was gone, and it was too late for questions or confrontations or interventions that would only prolong the inevitable. I just wanted to handle this quietly and spare everyone the mess of watching me fall apart, piece by piece. "Spare everyone," he repeated, his jaw clenching with barely controlled rage that made the air between us feel electric and dangerous. And he closed the distance separating us with 2 long strides that brought him close enough that I could smell his cologne, cedar and smoke and something darkly expensive that I'd always associated with safety, even when logic told me that Dante Caruso was the least safe person I'd ever known. "Or spare yourself the discomfort of letting people care about you, of admitting that you might need help, of trusting that maybe you matter enough to the people in your life that they'd want to know you were dying before you fucking disappeared into the woods to do it alone." His words hit like physical blows, each one landing precisely where I was most vulnerable, most ashamed of the choices I'd made. And I felt tears burning behind my eyes that I absolutely refused to let fall, because I'd already cried enough in the past week to last whatever remained of my lifetime, and I would not break down in front of him, would not prove that I was exactly as weak and pathetic as I felt. "I matter as your employee," I said, lifting my chin with whatever dignity I could salvage from this disaster of a confrontation, forcing myself to meet his eyes even though looking at him directly had always felt like staring into the sun, dangerous and overwhelming and capable of leaving permanent damage. "I matter as someone who knows where the bodies are buried, literally, in some cases, and who could theoretically become a liability if I fell into the wrong hands or got careless in my final days. But that's not the same as mattering in any way that would justify what you're doing right now, tracking me down and looking at me like I've personally betrayed you, when all I did was try to resign with dignity and handle my own death like a responsible adult who doesn't want to burden other people with her problems." "Burden," he said, the word coming out like a curse. And suddenly his hands were on my arms, gripping with enough force that I could feel the heat of his palms through my sweater, could feel the tremor of emotion he was barely containing, running through his fingers into my skin like an electric current. "You think you'd be a burden, think that watching you die would be some kind of inconvenience I'd resent. Like I haven't spent the last 72 hours losing my mind trying to find you. Like I didn't tear apart your apartment looking for clues and threaten your building manager and call in every favor I had to track you to this cabin, because the thought of you dying alone in the fucking woods was making me insane." I couldn't breathe suddenly, couldn't process what he was saying, because it didn't fit with anything I knew about our relationship, about the careful professional distance we'd always maintained, about the way he'd never looked at me like anything other than a particularly competent piece of office, equipment that happened to be useful and pleasant to have around. "You would have found out eventually," I said, hating how my voice shook, hating that my body was betraying me in yet another way, by responding to his proximity with a longing so intense it felt like another kind of dying. "When I didn't come back to work, when someone finally checked my office and found the letters, you would have known, and you could have hired a new assistant and moved on with your life without having to watch me deteriorate, without having to pretend you cared about someone who was always just an employee to you, someone who made your life easier but was ultimately replaceable." "Replaceable," he repeated, and there was something almost like anguish in his voice now. Something that made my chest tighten and my heart stutter because Dante Caruso didn't do anguish, didn't do vulnerability, didn't let anyone see beneath the armor he'd constructed from violence and control and absolute certainty. I've Had 6 different assistants quit in the 3 days since you left, Isabeau? 6 different people who couldn't last a single shift because they weren't you, because they didn't know how I take my coffee or which phone calls to screen, or how to read my moods before I've even acknowledged them myself, because they were afraid of me instead of just calmly competent in the face of everything I am. And you think that makes you replaceable? His words were dismantling every assumption I'd built my decision on, every careful rationalization I'd constructed to justify running away, and I felt myself starting to crack under the pressure of hoping for things I'd taught myself not to want. Dangerous things like mattering to him beyond my utility, like being seen as something more than just the woman who managed his schedule and kept his secrets. Then hire someone competent, I said, the words coming out desperate and pleading because I needed him to stop, needed him to let me have this one thing I'd chosen for myself, the manner and timing of my own death. Needed him to stop making me want to stay, when staying would only mean watching his expression change, from whatever this was to pity and obligation, as I got sicker and weaker and less like the person he'd relied on. Find someone smart and discreet who can learn your preferences and manage your empire, because I can't come back, Dante. Can't go back to that office and pretend everything is normal when I'm dying. Can't watch you look at me with pity every morning when you realize I've lost more weight, or need to leave early for doctor's appointments, or can't work the same hours because the pain medication makes me foggy and useless. I don't want someone else, he said, his voice dropping to something low and rough that I'd never heard from him before. Something that bypassed my brain entirely and went straight to parts of me that had no business responding when I was dying, and this conversation was already the most surreal experience of my life. I don't want competent and discreet. I want you, want the woman who's been keeping my world running for 2 years, who knows me better than anyone else alive, who I trust more than my own blood, and you don't get to decide that you're not important enough to fight for, Isabeau. You don't get to make that choice without me having any say in it. What are you saying? I asked, the question barely more than a whisper because I was terrified of the answer. Terrified that I was reading too much into his words and would humiliate myself by hoping for something impossible, but also terrified that I might be reading them exactly right and would have to confront feelings I'd spent 2 years suppressing because they had no place in our professional relationship. What could you possibly want from me now when I'm dying, when I have maybe 4 months left, if I'm lucky, and probably less, when I can't give you what you need from an assistant or from anyone else, because I'm too broken to be useful anymore? I want you to let me take you back to the city, he said, his hands sliding from my arms to my face, cupping my cheeks with a gentleness I'd never imagined him capable of, forcing me to maintain eye contact when every instinct I had was screaming at me to look away, before I saw something in his expression that would ruin me completely. I want you to see my doctor, the one who patches up bullet wounds and asks no questions, and let him examine you and tell us exactly what we're dealing with. And then I want you to let me get you the best treatment available anywhere in the world, because you might have given up on yourself, Isabeau. But I haven't given up on you, and I'm not letting you die alone in this cabin when there's even the smallest chance that we can buy you more time. Time for what? I asked, tears finally escaping, despite my best efforts to contain them, running hot down my cheeks and over his hands that were still cradling my face like I was something precious instead of something broken. Time for you to watch me waste away. Time for you to feel obligated to care for someone who's dying. Time for me to become everything I never wanted to be to you, weak and needy and dependent on your charity. Time for me to tell you the truth, he said, and then he was leaning in, closing the distance between us until his forehead rested against mine, until I could feel his breath on my lips and smell coffee and mint and the familiar scent of him that had haunted my dreams for 2 years. Time for me to tell you that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day you started working for me, that you've been driving me insane with your competence and your calm and that sharp mind that never misses anything, that I've wanted to kiss you during every single board meeting and take you on my desk after everyone leaves and wake up with you in my bed. And I've been too much of a coward to admit it because I was afraid of scaring you away, afraid of crossing lines that can't be uncrossed, afraid that you'd quit if you knew how much I wanted you. The world tilted sideways, reality reshaping itself around his words, in ways I couldn't comprehend, couldn't process, couldn't believe even as every cell in my traitorous body was singing with joy at finally hearing what I'd dreamed of hearing for so long. "You can't," I whispered, the denial automatic and desperate because accepting what he was saying would mean accepting hope. And hope was the cruelest thing I could allow myself when I was dying. "You can't want me like that. Can't have feelings for me when I'm not going to survive this. When falling for me now is just signing up for grief and loss, and watching someone you care about disappear. And I won't do that to you, Dante. Won't let you care about me when it's only going to hurt you in the end." "Too late," he said, his thumb brushing away my tears with a tenderness that was breaking me apart and putting me back together simultaneously. And there was something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Something vulnerable and fierce and utterly unguarded that made me realize he was telling the truth. That this wasn't pity or obligation, but something real and terrifying and completely impossible. "I'm already in too deep, have been for longer than I want to admit. And you running away just made me realize that I can't lose you without fighting for every single day we might have left. So you're going to come back to the city with me. And you're going to let me get you the best medical care money can buy. And you're going to give me a chance to love you the way I should have been doing all along instead of hiding behind professional distance and pretending I didn't feel what I felt." And in that moment, with his hands on my face and his words rewriting everything I thought I knew about our relationship, with the impossible possibility of being loved by Dante, Caruso dangling in front of me like salvation I didn't deserve, I felt something shift inside me, felt the resignation I'd wrapped around myself like armor starting to crack and crumble, felt the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe dying didn't have to mean dying alone, that maybe I could be selfish enough to take what he was offering even knowing how it would end, that maybe love, even temporary, doomed love, was worth the pain it would cause both of us when the inevitable finally came. The drive back to the city felt like traveling through a dream where nothing was quite solid or real, where the familiar landscape outside the car windows seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone who hadn't spent the last week preparing to die alone, and who wasn't now sitting in the passenger seat of Dante Caruso's sleek black Mercedes, while he drove with one hand on the wheel and the other clasped around mine like he was afraid I might vanish if he let go, his thumb tracing absent circles on my palm that sent electricity racing up my arm and made it impossible to think about anything except the impossible confession he'd made in my cabin and the weight of everything that confession meant. I'd packed my few belongings in a daze, moving through the motions of closing up the cabin, while Dante watched me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, and I'd left the journal behind. Couldn't bear to bring those raw, desperate pages back to the city where they might be discovered, where someone might read my pathetic longings and realize just how completely I'd fallen for a man who I'd convinced myself could never want me back. And now we were racing toward a future I hadn't allowed myself to imagine, toward medical consultations and treatments and the terrifying possibility of hope, when I'd already made peace with hopelessness. "Tell me about the diagnosis," Dante said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since we'd left the mountains behind, his voice carefully controlled in that way that meant he was managing powerful emotions beneath the surface. And I found myself grateful for the question, because it gave me something concrete to focus on instead of the chaotic swirl of feelings his confession had unleashed inside me. "I want to know everything. When you found out, what the doctors told you, why you decided against treatment. All of it. Because I need to understand what we're dealing with if I'm going to figure out how to fight this." The urge to protect him from the brutal reality of my condition warred with the knowledge that he deserved the truth, that if I was going to accept his help, and God help me, I was going to accept it, was going to be selfish enough to take everything he was offering, even knowing it would end in grief, then I owed him honesty about what that help would be fighting against. 6 months ago, I began, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, detached and clinical like I was, reciting someone else's medical history instead of my own death sentence. I went to my doctor because I'd been having persistent stomach pain and unexpected weight loss. Nothing dramatic, just enough that I'd noticed my clothes fitting differently and food not appealing the way it used to. And I thought maybe it was stress or an ulcer or something manageable that could be fixed with medication and lifestyle changes. Dante's hand tightened on mine, his jaw clenching in a way that suggested he already knew this story wouldn't have a happy middle even if he was determined to rewrite the ending, and I forced myself to continue, to push through the clinical recitation of the worst day of my life. They ran tests, blood work and scans, and eventually a biopsy, and the results came back showing stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had already metastasized to my liver and lymph nodes, which basically means the cancer had spread so extensively throughout my body that surgery wasn't an option, and the standard treatment protocols would be more about managing symptoms than actually curing anything. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, bitter and final, and I watched the city skyline growing larger through the windshield, watched us getting closer to the life I'd tried to leave behind. Dr. Chen was very kind about it, very straightforward in explaining that pancreatic cancer is particularly aggressive and difficult to treat even when caught early, and that at stage 4 with the level of metastasis I was showing, I was looking at somewhere between 4 to 8 months, depending on whether I chose to pursue chemotherapy or just palliative care. 8 months, Dante said, the words coming out harsh and angry, though I knew the anger wasn't directed at me but at the universe, at fate, at the unfairness of cancer choosing to attack someone he cared about when there were plenty of people in his world who arguably deserved death more than I did. They told you 8 months, maximum, and you decided to spend those months working 12-hour days in my office, bringing me coffee and managing my schedule and pretending nothing was wrong. And you didn't think I deserved to know? Didn't think I might want to have some say in how you spent whatever time you had left? The accusation in his voice made guilt twist in my stomach, sharp and acidic, because when he put it like that, I could see how selfish my choice had been, how I'd robbed him of months we could have spent differently if I'd been brave enough to trust him with the truth. I didn't want pity, I said, the explanation sounding inadequate even to my own ears. But it was the truth, or at least part of it. Didn't want to see the way people's faces change when they know you're dying, that particular expression that's half sympathy and half relief, that it's happening to you and not them. And I especially didn't want that from you. Didn't want to watch you treat me differently, carefully, like I was fragile china that might shatter if you spoke too loudly or demanded too much. I paused, gathering courage for the harder truth, the one that cut closer to the bone of why I'd really kept silent. And I was afraid that if you knew, you'd do exactly what you're doing now, try to fix it, throw money at the problem, call in favors and find specialists and turn my dying into a project you could manage, and I didn't want to be another problem for you to solve, Dante. Didn't want my last months to be defined by failed treatments and false hope, and the inevitable disappointment when your considerable resources couldn't change the outcome. So instead you decided to disappear, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, and I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, could feel the tension radiating from him in waves that made the air in the car feel charged and dangerous. Decided to resign without notice and leave cryptic letters and die alone in a cabin where no one who cared about you would even know to look for you until it was too late. And you thought that was somehow better than giving me a chance to help, than trusting that maybe I'd want to spend whatever time you had left actually with you, instead of wondering where you'd gone and why you'd left without saying goodbye. The pain in his voice was harder to bear than my own physical pain, cut deeper than the cancer that was eating me alive, and I found myself turning in my seat to look at him properly, to see the way his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his jaw was clenched so tight I worried he might crack teeth. I thought I was sparing you, I whispered, the admission feeling like exposing the softest, most vulnerable parts of myself to someone who had the power to destroy me with a word, with a look, with the withdrawal of the affection he'd so unexpectedly offered. Thought that if I just disappeared quietly, you'd be annoyed for a while about having to find a new assistant, but you'd move on and forget about me and wouldn't have to carry the weight of watching someone you cared about waste away. And yes, I know that was cowardly and selfish and probably the worst possible way to handle things, but I've never been good at asking for help. Have never been the kind of person who knows how to accept care from others without feeling like I'm taking something I haven't earned. We'd reached the city proper now, the familiar streets and buildings rising around us like a forest of steel and glass, and I felt the weight of returning to my old life pressing down on me. Felt the impossibility of pretending things could go back to normal when everything had fundamentally changed in the space of a single afternoon. Dante navigated through traffic with the easy confidence of someone who owned these streets, who'd built an empire in the shadows of these gleaming towers, and I watched his profile as he drove, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw and the dark intensity of his eyes and the way his lips pressed together when he was thinking hard about something, storing these details away like precious treasures I might need to sustain me later. "You don't have to earn the right to be cared for, Isabeau," he said finally, his voice softer now, gentler, and he glanced at me with an expression that made my heart stutter and my breath catch. "You don't have to prove your worth or justify your existence or be useful enough to deserve help. You just have to be you, and that's been enough for me since the first week you started working in my office and I realized you were the only person I'd ever met who wasn't afraid of me but wasn't trying to use me either, who just saw me as a person instead of a monster or a meal ticket." His words were reshaping something fundamental inside me, challenging beliefs I'd held since childhood about my own value and what I had to do to deserve love or care or basic human kindness. And I felt tears threatening again, felt the careful control I'd maintained for so long starting to crumble under the weight of being seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice breaking on the words, and I gestured vaguely at the space between us, at the impossible situation we'd found ourselves in. "Don't know how to let you help me, how to accept that you might actually want me the way you said you did, how to believe that this isn't just some noble impulse that you'll regret when the reality of my situation becomes too much to handle." "Then let me show you," he said, and he was pulling the car into an underground parking garage beneath a building I recognized as one of the most expensive residential towers in the city. All luxury penthouses and elite security and the kind of exclusivity that came with 8-figure price tags. "Let me take care of you the way I should have been doing all along. Let me prove that this isn't pity or obligation or some temporary madness that will fade when things get difficult. Because I've spent 2 years wanting you and hiding it and telling myself all the reasons why I couldn't have you. And I'm done with that. Done pretending I don't feel what I feel. Done letting fear or propriety or the fact that you worked for me keep me from telling you that you're the best thing that's ever happened to my fucked up life." He parked the car in a spot marked "Private Penthouse" and killed the engine, then turned to face me fully, his dark eyes intense and unwavering, pinning me in place with the force of his attention. "I'm taking you upstairs to my home," he continued, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear with a tenderness that made me want to weep. "I've already had Dr. Reeves clear his schedule. He'll be there in an hour to examine you and review your medical records. And then we're going to discuss treatment options, real options from the best oncologists in the country, not just the standard protocols that some overworked doctor at a public hospital offered you 6 months ago." His hand slid down to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a caress that felt more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. "And while we're fighting this cancer with every resource I have available, while we're buying you time and hoping for miracles, you're going to stay with me. Let me take care of you. Let me show you what it feels like to be loved by someone who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself." The casual way he said "loved," like it was a foregone conclusion rather than an impossible dream, made something inside my chest crack wide open, made hope flood in through the fissures, despite every attempt I'd made to keep it locked away, where it couldn't hurt me. "You're home," I repeated, focusing on the practical detail, because the rest was too overwhelming to process, too enormous to fit inside my understanding of what was possible. "You're taking me to your home, not some guest apartment or safe house or hotel suite, but actually to your personal space, the place where you live." I'm taking you to the penthouse I've lived in alone for the last 5 years, he confirmed, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression now. Something that suggested this mattered to him in ways I didn't fully understand yet. Taking you to the space I've never shared with anyone, never let anyone stay in overnight, never trusted anyone enough to see me without the armor I wear for the rest of the world. Because you're not just anyone, Isabeau. You're the woman who's been keeping my secrets and managing my chaos and making my life better just by existing in it. And if you think I'm letting you face this alone, letting you die without fighting for every moment we could have together, then you don't know me nearly as well as I thought you did. He got out of the car then, came around to my side and opened my door with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed incongruous coming from a man whose hands had killed people, whose empire was built on violence and fear and the kind of power that came from being willing to do things other men wouldn't. I let him help me out, let him keep his hand on the small of my back as he guided me toward the elevator, let myself lean into his solid warmth because I was tired, so tired of being strong alone, of carrying the weight of my dying without anyone to share the burden. The elevator was all mirrors and polished metal, rising swiftly toward the top floor, and I watched our reflection as we ascended. Dante tall and commanding in his expensive suit, looking every inch the powerful man he was, and me thin and pale beside him, wearing jeans and a sweater that hung loose on my diminished frame, looking exactly like what I was, which was someone who'd been dying quietly while the world went on around her. I'm scared, I admitted as we rose higher, the confession, slipping out before I could stop it, before I could remember that I was supposed to be brave and competent and capable of handling anything. Scared of hoping for something better when hope has always led to disappointment. Scared of letting you into my dying when I'd made peace with doing it alone. Scared of what happens when your resources and your determination run up against the reality that some things can't be fixed, no matter how much money you throw at them, or how badly you want a different outcome. The elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse, revealing a space that was somehow exactly what I'd expected, and nothing like I'd imagined. Minimalist and masculine with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city. Expensive furniture that managed to be both beautiful and comfortable, and an overall aesthetic that spoke of wealth and taste but also of loneliness, of a man who'd built a fortress to keep the world out, and had been living in it alone for far too long. Dante pulled me into the space, into his private sanctuary, and then he was cupping my face in both hands, forcing me to meet his eyes, forcing me to see the truth written in his expression. Then be scared with me, he said, his voice rough with emotion, with want, with something that looked terrifyingly like love. Be scared and uncertain and overwhelmed, but be those things here with me instead of alone in that cabin, and let me be scared too about the possibility of losing you, about not having enough time, about failing to save someone I care about, because this isn't about me being strong enough to fix everything, Isabeau. This is about us facing whatever comes together, and that starts right now, right here, with you trusting me enough to let me try. And standing there in his penthouse with the city spread out below us, and his hands warm on my face and the impossible possibility of his love wrapping around me like a promise, I felt the last of my resistance crumble, felt myself surrendering to the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, dying didn't have to mean giving up on living first, and that whatever time I had left could be spent with this complicated, dangerous, surprisingly tender man who'd somehow managed to see past my careful masks to the woman underneath who'd been desperately in love with him all along. Dr. Reeves arrived exactly 1 hour later, carrying a medical bag that seemed too small to contain hope, but somehow did anyway. And I found myself sitting on Dante's enormous leather sofa, while this kind-eyed man, who'd apparently patched up gunshot wounds and knife injuries, without asking questions now, examined me with the same gentle efficiency, asking about my symptoms and pain levels and the progression of the disease over the past 6 months, while Dante paced behind us like a caged predator, radiating tension and barely controlled anxiety that would have been endearing if it weren't so obviously rooted in genuine fear of losing me. The examination was thorough but not invasive, Dr. Reeves clearly experienced enough to gather the information he needed without making me feel like a specimen under a microscope. And when he finally sat back and looked between Dante and me with an expression that managed to be both professionally neutral and personally sympathetic, I felt my stomach clench with anticipation of whatever verdict he was about to deliver, whatever timeline he was going to assign to the remainder of my rapidly diminishing life. "The cancer is aggressive," Dr. Reeves said, his voice calm and measured in a way that probably came from years of delivering bad news to dangerous men who didn't handle disappointment well, and I watched Dante's hands curl into fists at his sides, watched the muscle in his jaw jump as he fought to maintain control over whatever violent impulses my diagnosis was triggering. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer with metastasis to the liver and lymph nodes is exactly as serious as your previous doctor indicated, and under normal circumstances, I'd be telling you to get your affairs in order and prepare for palliative care within the next few months. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they? Because you're sitting in Dante Caruso's penthouse, and he's made it abundantly clear that money is no object, and that I'm to explore every possible option regardless of cost or conventional medical wisdom. The slight smile that crossed Dr. Reeves's face suggested he'd been through similar conversations before, had probably been asked to work miracles for other people Dante cared about, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid to hope but unable to stop the treacherous flutter of possibility that was building in my chest despite every attempt to keep my expectations firmly grounded in reality. "There's a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins," Dr. Reeves continued, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be medical research papers and treatment protocols. "Experimental immunotherapy combined with targeted radiation, designed specifically for late-stage pancreatic cancer patients who've been deemed too advanced for conventional treatment, and the early results are promising. Not curative, I want to be very clear about that. But we're seeing tumor reduction in 60% of participants, and life extension averaging 18 to 24 months, beyond initial prognosis, with some patients exceeding 3 years, and maintaining reasonable quality of life throughout. 24 months. 2 years. The numbers seemed impossibly large compared to the 4 months I'd resigned myself to. Seemed like a lifetime when I'd already started counting my remaining days and weeks, and I felt Dante's hand land on my shoulder, heavy and warm and grounding. Felt him squeeze gently as if he could sense that I was spiraling between hope and disbelief. "What are the side effects?" I managed to ask, my voice surprisingly steady considering the chaos of emotions churning inside me, because I'd read enough about cancer treatments to know that extending life often came at the cost of quality of life, that extra months could mean extra months of suffering if the treatment was harsh enough. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being violently ill and unable to function. Don't want to trade a quick death for a slow one that's just marginally longer and significantly more miserable." Dr. Reeves nodded appreciatively, like he was glad I was asking the hard questions instead of just grasping desperately at any promise of more time. "The side effects are manageable. Fatigue, some nausea that responds well to antiemetic medications, possible hair thinning, though not the complete hair loss you'd see with traditional chemotherapy, and occasional joint pain that we can control with anti-inflammatories," he explained, his fingers moving across the tablet to show me charts and graphs that meant nothing to my untrained eye but apparently illustrated whatever points he was making. "The treatment protocol is aggressive but not debilitating, designed to let patients maintain relatively normal activity levels between sessions, and the patients who respond well to the therapy report being able to work, travel, engage in normal activities throughout most of the treatment period, with quality of life remaining high until very near the end, if and when the cancer eventually progresses beyond what the treatment can control." I looked up at Dante, found him already watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch, his dark eyes asking questions he wasn't voicing, asking if I was willing to fight, willing to hope, willing to take the risk of believing that maybe we could have more time together than the universe had originally allotted us. "It's not a guarantee," I said, the words directed at him, even though Dr. Reeves was still in the room, still watching our exchange with professional discretion. Even if I get into the trial, even if the treatment works, I'm still dying, Dante, just potentially slower than I would be otherwise. And I don't want you to invest everything into saving me only to lose me anyway in a year or 2 or 3. Don't want you to build hope on a foundation that's still ultimately going to crumble. Then we'll have a year or 2 or 3 instead of 4 months, Dante said, his voice fierce and uncompromising, and he moved around the sofa to kneel in front of me, taking my hands in his and holding them like they were something precious and fragile. We'll have time for me to take you to Paris like you mentioned once wanting to see. Time for you to teach me how to actually relax instead of working every waking hour. Time for us to figure out what this thing between us could be if we're not hiding behind professional boundaries and pretending we don't feel what we feel. And yes, it will end eventually. Yes, I'll lose you and it will destroy me, but I'd rather have that pain and those memories than spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been if I'd fought harder to keep you. The rawness in his voice, the absolute certainty in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly where they held mine, all of it combined to shatter the last of my resistance, to make me realize that protecting him from grief by dying alone wasn't noble or kind. It was just cowardice dressed up as sacrifice, and that if he was brave enough to love someone who was dying, the least I could do was be brave enough to let him. Okay, I whispered, the word feeling monumental, feeling like I was agreeing to more than just medical treatment, like I was agreeing to actually live whatever remained of my life instead of just quietly waiting for death. Okay, I'll do the trial. I'll fight. I'll let you help me, but you have to promise me something in return. Anything, Dante said immediately, without hesitation, and I believed him, believed he would move mountains and burn the world if I asked him to. Promise me that when it gets bad at the end, when the treatment stops working and I'm actually dying, you'll let me go with dignity, I said, forcing myself to hold his gaze even though talking about my inevitable death when we'd just agreed to fight for more time felt like dousing hope with cold water. Promise me you won't make me suffer through endless interventions just to buy a few more days, that you'll remember I want quality over quantity, that loving me means respecting my choices about my own death when that time finally comes. Something painful flickered across his face, some emotion too complex to name, but he nodded slowly, his grip on my hands tightening. I promise, he said, his voice rough. When that time comes, I'll let you go, but until then, you're mine, Isabeau Moreau. Mine to protect and care for and love however much time we have, and I'm going to make damn sure you don't regret choosing to stay. 8 months had passed, since that afternoon in Dante's penthouse when Dr. Reeves had offered me hope wrapped in clinical trials and experimental treatments, 8 months of immunotherapy sessions that left me tired but functional, of mornings waking up in Dante's bed with his arm wrapped around my waist like he was afraid I might disappear if he loosened his grip, of learning what it meant to be loved by a man who approached my survival with the same ruthless determination he brought to building his empire, and the scans from yesterday had shown what we'd both been afraid to hope for. The tumors had shrunk, not disappeared, but reduced enough that Dr. Reeves was using words like significant response, and exceeded expectations, and potentially years instead of months. I was sitting on the balcony of the penthouse now, wrapped in one of Dante's shirts, because I'd claimed all his comfortable clothes as my own over the past months, watching the sun set over the city that had become home in ways it never was, when I was just surviving instead of living. And I could hear him moving around inside, preparing dinner because he'd discovered he actually enjoyed cooking when it meant taking care of me, when it meant showing love through perfectly seasoned pasta and vegetables he insisted I eat to keep my strength up. The past 8 months had been nothing like I'd imagined they would be. Nothing like the quiet resignation and peaceful acceptance I'd planned for in that cabin in the mountains. Because Dante Caruso didn't do quiet or peaceful or accepting. Didn't approach my illness like something to surrender to, but rather like an enemy to be fought with every weapon in his considerable arsenal. He'd gotten me into the Johns Hopkins trial within a week, had flown me to Baltimore every other week for treatments, had held my hand through the nausea and sat with me during the fatigue and never once looked at me like I was fragile or broken, or less than the woman he'd fallen for. And somewhere between the first treatment and the most recent scan, I'd stopped thinking of myself as dying and started thinking of myself as living, as someone who had a future that extended beyond the next few months, as someone who deserved to make plans and dream dreams and imagine tomorrows that might actually come. We'd gone to Paris in the spring, had walked along the Seine with his arm around my shoulders, and eaten croissants in sidewalk cafes, and made love in a hotel room with windows overlooking the Eiffel Tower, and I'd cried happy tears because I'd never thought I'd have that experience, had resigned myself to dying without ever seeing the city I'd dreamed about since childhood. But Dante had given it to me, had given me so many things I'd thought were impossible. He'd taken me to the opera because I'd mentioned once that I'd never been, had bought out an entire restaurant for my birthday, so I could have an intimate dinner without worrying about my medical port being visible or needing to leave early if I felt unwell, had learned to read my moods and energy levels with the same precision he brought to reading his business associates and their hidden agendas. And he'd loved me through the bad days and the good ones with an unwavering constancy that had slowly convinced me I was worth loving even when I was sick, even when I was scared, even when I was less than the capable, competent woman I'd always tried to be. The sliding door opened behind me, and I felt, rather than saw, Dante join me on the balcony, felt his presence like a physical warmth at my back, before his arms came around me, pulling me against his chest in an embrace that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. "Dr. Reeves called," he said, his voice rumbling against my back. And I felt my heart stutter because phone calls from doctors could mean anything. Could mean the treatment had stopped working, or the cancer was progressing, or that we'd run out of time after all. "The oncology team at Hopkins wants to present your case at their national conference, wants to use your results as evidence that the trial should move to the next phase, and they're talking about you being one of their best responders, about the possibility that you might be in this manageable holding pattern for years if we're lucky." Years. The word hung in the air between us, impossible and precious and terrifying in its potential, and I turned in his arms to face him, to see the hope and fear and fierce possessiveness written across his features in the dying light of the sunset. "Years of treatments and scans and living with uncertainty," I said, needing him to understand what he was signing up for, what loving me long-term actually meant beyond the dramatic romance of saving me from dying alone. "Years of me not being able to promise you a future, of every scan potentially being the one that shows progression, of knowing that this disease is still inside me and could start winning again at any moment, and you deserve more than that, Dante. Deserve someone who can give you certainty and health and a life that isn't built around medical appointments and clinical trials." "I deserve you," he said, his hands coming up to frame my face with a tenderness that still surprised me after 8 months of experiencing it daily. And there was something absolute in his voice, something that brooked no argument. "I deserve the woman who saw past the monster everyone else sees, who managed my chaos with grace, who loved me even when she thought she was dying, and that love was hopeless. And if having you means living with uncertainty and medical appointments, and the possibility that I might lose you sooner than I want, then that's what I choose because a life with you, however long that is better than any certain future without you." He kissed me then, slow and deep and full of promise, and I kissed him back with everything I had, with gratitude and love and the fierce joy of being alive when I'd expected to be dead, of being loved when I'd thought I was unlovable, of having a future when I'd already written my ending. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, the city lights were starting to twinkle below us. Millions of illuminated windows representing millions of lives being lived, and I realized that I was one of those lives now, that I'd been given a reprieve I'd never expected, and a love I'd never thought I deserved, and that whatever came next, whether it was years or months or decades, I would face it with this complicated, dangerous, unexpectedly tender man at my side. "I love you," I said, the words still feeling new and precious, even though I'd said them hundreds of times over the past months, even though he knew it as surely as he knew his own name. I love you for finding me when I ran, for fighting for me when I'd given up on myself, for showing me that dying doesn't have to mean stopping living, and for making every single day we have together worth whatever comes after. I love you too, he said, pulling me closer, tucking my head under his chin so I could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong and alive. I love you for seeing me, for staying, for being brave enough to hope when hope seemed impossible. And I promise you that however much time we get, whether it's the years the doctors are suggesting or something shorter or something longer, I'm going to spend every moment of it making sure you know how much you matter, how much you've changed everything, how you took a man who thought he was incapable of real connection and taught him what it means to love someone more than power, or control, or survival. We stood there as darkness fell completely. Two people who'd found each other in the shadow of death and chosen life instead. Chosen love instead. Chosen to build something beautiful and temporary and absolutely worth having, despite its inevitable ending. And I thought about the letters I'd left on my desk all those months ago, about the woman who'd written them thinking she was nobody, thinking she was saving everyone the burden of caring, thinking that dying alone was dignity instead of the saddest thing she could possibly choose. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I'd been in another life. And in her place was this version of me, still sick, still fighting, still uncertain about the future, but loved and loving and fully, completely, radiantly alive in ways that had nothing to do with the number of heartbeats I had left, and everything to do with the quality of each one I was given. I'd quit my job without notice, had left a death letter in my desk, had run away to die alone in the mountains, and Dante Caruso had found me anyway, had refused to let me go quietly into that good night, had loved me back to life in the most literal sense possible. And now here we were 8 months later, standing on his balcony with the future stretched out before us like an unwritten story, uncertain and precious and ours for however long we could hold on to it. Some people got decades together. Some got years. Some got only moments. But every single one of us ended the same way eventually. And what mattered wasn't the length of the story, but the depth of it, the courage to love despite inevitable loss, the willingness to be vulnerable and open and fully present for whatever time we had. And I had learned that lesson in the most painful and beautiful way possible, had learned it from a man whose hands had killed but whose heart had saved me. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of our borrowed time together for all the certain, safe, lonely years I could have had without him.